Number 1. John Allen. Muhammad was 41 years old when he was arrested in Maryland in October of 2002. A former U.S. Army sergeant, he had served as a combat engineer and qualified as an expert marksman with the military's standard rifle training that helped explain how he could fire accurately from a concealed position. Born John Allen Williams in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he lost his mother when he was very young and was raised largely by relatives. In adulthood, he joined the Nation of Islam and later changed his last name to Muhammad. In the lead-up to the attacks, Muhammad was separated from his second wife, and investigators noted that a restraining order made firearm possession a federal violation for him. He was also traveling with Lee Boyd Malvo, a teenager who would become his co-defendant, and the pair moved through the region with a mobility that made the threat feel impossible to predict. The crime wave, known as the D.C. Sniper attacks, unfolded across Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia from early October through late October of 2002. Victims were shot in ordinary places, parking lots, sidewalks, and gas stations, while they shopped, worked, or paused for a moment in public. Federal investigators said 10 people were killed, and 3 others were critically injured during the series. The 10 people killed in the Washington area attacks were James Martin, James Buchanan, Prem Kumar, Walakar, Sarah Ramos, Lori Ann Lewis Rivera, Pascal Charlot, Dean Harold Myers, Kenneth Bridges, Linda Franklin, and Conrad Johnson. As fear spread, the shooters tried to control the investigation. Tarot death cards were left at some scenes, including one marked with the phrase, "Call me God." Police also received communications demanding $10 million in exchange for stopping the shootings, a pressure tactic meant to force authorities into response. Prosecutors later argued that alongside extortion, Muhammad's personal grievances and family conflict were part of the backdrop, though motives were contested across jurisdictions and proceedings. According to the FBI, the critical break came after a call from someone claiming to be the sniper pointed detectives toward a prior Alabama crime. Fingerprint evidence connected Malvo to that earlier scene, and an associated record led investigators to Muhammad. Authorities circulated a description of a blue Chevrolet Caprice, and at 3:19 in the morning on October 24th, agents located the car and arrested both men near Frederick, Maryland. In the vehicle, investigators found a Bushmaster .223 caliber rifle. They also documented how the trunk had been modified with a firing hole near the license plate and recovered items tied to planning and communication, including a digital voice recorder used for extortion, demands, and a stolen laptop containing maps and routes. In Virginia, Muhammad was convicted of capital murder for the killing of Dean Harold Myers and of related conspiracy and firearm offenses, and a jury sentenced him to death. John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia on November 10, 2009. Number 2. Jason Thomas Scott was 26 years old when he was arrested in Prince George's County, Maryland, in early July of 2009. He was known publicly as a quiet local man who worked at a UPS facility, and investigators later described him as someone who could blend into everyday life, holding a steady job while secretly building a pattern of break-ins around the neighborhoods where he grew up. Police and federal prosecutors said Scott's criminal life didn't begin with the murders. They said he admitted to a long run of burglaries that evolved into armed home invasion robberies, and that the behavior escalated over time as he became more confident and more aggressive. In the federal case, authorities characterized him as a professional criminal who progressed from burglaries to home invasions, using planning and intimidation to control victims and scenes. That idea of control showed up again and again in how detectives said the killings were carried out careful timing entry, without obvious forced damage, and choices that left a community struggling to understand whether the victims were targeted or simply selected. In one of the most unsettling details raised publicly, investigators believed he used access at UPS to search information that could help him identify homes and study how law enforcement builds cases as if he were trying to stay one step ahead. The first killing linked to Scott by authorities occurred in Bowie in June of 2008, when Vilma Butler, 46 years old, was killed during a home invasion. News reports later said the crime also involved an attempt to destroy evidence by setting the home on fire, intensifying fears that the offender was not only willing to kill, but willing to erase what he could afterward. Then, in late January of 2009, Karen Lofton, 45, a nurse, and her 16-year-old daughter Carissa were killed inside their locked Largo home. Investigators noted the alarm system had been neutralized, and there were no clear signs of forced entry details that made the case feel calculated and deeply personal, even when no direct connection was obvious. Less than 2 months later, in March of 2009, Dolores DeWitt, 42, and her 20-year-old daughter Ebony were killed after someone entered their home. Their stolen car was later found burning nearby, adding another layer of confusion about whether the motive was robbery concealment or something more deliberate. At the time, even an FBI profiler initially believed the two mother-daughter cases were not connected, an illustration of how effectively the offender appeared to shift and disguise patterns. The break that finally closed in on Scott came through a separate investigation, stolen weapons and home invasion robberies. Reports said a cooperating informant bought a gun from him, leading to a search warrant and a trail of physical evidence tying him to a wider series of crimes. He was arrested on July 1, 2009, and held as federal and local investigators continued building the homicide cases. In federal court, Scott was convicted on 11 felony charges connected to burglaries and home invasion robberies, and a judge sentenced him to 100 years in prison in January of 2012. In September of 2013, he entered an Alford plea in the DeWitt murders and was sentenced to 85 years in prison, while prosecutors dropped charges tied to the other killings as part of the agreement. Number 3. Benjamin Adam Sifrit was 24 years old when he was arrested in Ocean City, Maryland in late May of 2002. News coverage described him as a former Navy SEAL, and he and his wife, Erica Elaine Sifrit, were living in Altoona, Pennsylvania. To people who met them casually, they could seem like a normal couple on a holiday trip, social, confident, and easy to miss in a crowd. That Memorial Day weekend, Martha Margine Jeannie Crutchley, 51, traveled from Virginia with her boyfriend, Joshua Edward Ford, 32. On Saturday night, May 25th, they met the Sifrits on a bus headed to Secrets, a popular Ocean City nightclub. The Sifrits did not have exact change for the fare, and Crutchley and Ford covered it. The small kindness turned into a night out together. The kind of brief vacation friendship that usually ends with a handshake and a goodbye. Instead, the night ended with confusion and fear. In the early morning hours, Erica called 911 from the Sifrits' condominium, saying she could not find her purse and that people she did not know were inside. The call ended abruptly, and no officer was dispatched. Prosecutors later argued that the missing purse was a pretext used to accuse and intimidate, escalating the situation inside the condominium. After the holiday, Crutchley failed to return to work. Police found her car still in Ocean City and discovered the couple's belongings left behind. With no clear suspect, investigators worked backward from the last confirmed sightings trying to identify everyone the couple had met. The break came from an alarm at a different location. Around midnight on Friday, May 31st, Ocean City Police responded to a burglary call at a closed Hooters restaurant and merchandise store. Officers found Benjamin and Erica loading items into their vehicle and arrested them. When Erica asked officers to retrieve anxiety medication from her purse, an officer searching for it discovered identification cards belonging to Crutchley and Ford. Detectives immediately searched the Sifrit's condominium. Court records describe physical evidence inside the unit connecting the location to the missing couple, and the victims were later found in Delaware. As the case drew national attention, prosecutors told jurors there was no obvious practical motive like a simple robbery. The lack of a clear motive fueled the sense that control and escalation were the real drivers. At trial, prosecutors highlighted a disturbing pattern. A young woman named Melissa Selling testified that just days after the victims vanished, she was invited to the same condominium and was soon accused of stealing Erica's purse as well. She described Benjamin becoming increasingly threatening and speaking as if he had the right to judge other people's worth testimony. Prosecutors used to argue that intimidation itself was part of the point. Because of intense publicity, Benjamin Sifrit's case was moved out of Worcester County. A jury in Montgomery County convicted him of second-degree murder connected to Martha Crutchley, along with first-degree assault and accessory after the fact, while acquitting him of charges tied to Joshua Ford. In July of 2003, he was sentenced to a total of 38 years in prison. He remains incarcerated in Maryland. Number 4. Stephen Howard. Oken was 25 years old when he was arrested in Maine after a string of killings that began in Maryland in November of 1987. He lived in Baltimore County, and according to later reporting was a college dropout with a rocky marriage who worked at his father's pharmacy. Behind that ordinary surface, he drank heavily and used tranquilizers, and people close to him saw his moods becoming harder to predict. Family accounts traced some of that instability to an early shock. Oken learned around age 11 that he had been abandoned at birth and adopted, and his mother later described an intense emotional reaction. As an adult, substance abuse became routine. In later sentencing litigation, the defense and prosecutors argued over his mental state, and evaluators discussed traits consistent with sexual sadism and a desire for domination. On Sunday, November 1st, 1987, Dawn Marie Garvin, 20 years old and recently married, stopped answering repeated calls from her husband, a Navy aircraft mechanic stationed in Virginia. He asked her family to check on her, and she was found in her White Marsh apartment. Maryland court records noted no clear signs of forced entry suggesting the attacker gained access without breaking a door. Investigators concluded Garvin was sexually assaulted and fatally shot. Roughly 2 weeks later, the violence moved into Oken's own family circle. Patricia Antoinette Hurt, 43 years old, was his sister-in-law. Authorities said she went to Oken's White Marsh townhouse and was sexually assaulted and shot there. The choice of victim added a chilling layer, someone connected to his everyday life drawn into a private space he could control. After Hurt's killing, Oken fled Maryland and drove north. On Monday, November 16, 1987, he checked into a motel in Kittery, Maine. Lori Elizabeth Ward, 25 years old, was working as a desk clerk when she was killed during an incident that led to charges of murder, armed robbery, and theft. Maine investigators quickly narrowed in on the guest who had rented a room and then vanished, tracing his movements beyond the motel. On Tuesday, November 17th, Oken was taken into custody in Freeport, Maine, the day after Ward was killed. In later rulings, judges upheld the use of evidence recovered from the motel room, concluding Oken had effectively abandoned it before police searched. The prosecutions unfolded in 2 states. In Maine, Oken entered an Alford plea in April of 1989 and received a life sentence for Ward's murder with additional concurrent time for robbery and theft. Maryland then brought him back for the Baltimore County cases. A jury convicted him in January of 1991 for the murder of Don Garvin and related offenses, and after a separate proceeding, a judge found him criminally responsible. The jury sentenced him to death. Oken later pleaded guilty to the murder of Patricia Hurt and received a separate life sentence, while his death warrant came only after years of appeals. On Thursday, June 17, 2004, Stephen Howard Oken was executed by lethal injection at the Metropolitan Transition Center in Baltimore, Maryland. Number 5. Charles Lee Dalton Sr. was 38 years old when Maryland State Police concluded he killed his wife and their 2 children in Mount Airy, Maryland, then ended his own life. He worked overnight as a maintenance worker for Montgomery County Schools, and he also did home improvement and cabinet installation work through a small business he ran from home called Imagine Millwork. To neighbors, the family appeared private and steady church-going, polite and easy to overlook in the best way. Jennifer Ann Baker, Fincham Dalton, was 37. She was active at Hebron Christian Church and served as a leader in its arts ministry. She worked part-time at a veterinary hospital and had recently completed schooling as a veterinary technician, building a life around caring for animals and supporting her community. Their son, Charles Lee Dalton Jr., was 14, a freshman at Linganore High School, who participated in youth activities at church and was involved in the Mount Airy Junior Volunteer Fire Department program. Their daughter, Emmeline Elizabeth Dalton, was 7 and loved children's ministry programs, often described as a bright, eager helper with a smile people remembered. In the days after the deaths, investigators said they found no suicide note and could not clearly identify a motive. Still, one pressure point surfaced in official comments and neighborhood conversation finances. A state police spokesman said it was possible financial difficulties were part of what drove the crime. Neighbors told reporters the home had been listed for sale for about a year, and one described Dalton as scraping by in a weak economy. In that light, his routine running a small contracting business, while also relying on night shift work, looked less like ambition and more like strain. Investigators believe the killings happened late Thursday night, September 24, 2009, or early Friday morning, September 25th. Police said Jennifer and the children were in their beds when they were killed with a 12-gauge shotgun. Dalton was found in the master bedroom, and police said the shotgun was near him. Authorities also reported that the family's beagle was killed. The details released publicly pointed to a controlled private act carried out inside a home that had seemed peaceful from the street. The first warning came from absence. On Friday morning, Jennifer did not show up for her shift at the veterinary hospital in Damascus. Co-workers tried calling, then decided to check on her in person. Later that afternoon, a family friend called 911 after seeing a body through a rear window. State troopers and local responders arrived at the home on the 300 block of Contour Road and confirmed that 4 members of the household were dead. Charles Lee Dalton Sr. died by suicide from a self-inflicted gunshot wound at the Mount Airy home, and authorities classified the case as a murder-suicide. Number 6. Sonia Katerina Spoon, a young mother and primary caregiver, was 24 years old when police took her into custody in Cheverly, Maryland, after the deaths of her 2 children, 3-year-old Kayla Thompson and 1-year-old Aidan Spoon. In the months before the case, Sonia and the kids were living with her parents on Forest Road in Prince George's County. In court, Sonia's background was described as complicated long before the night of the crimes. A psychiatrist testified that she had been abandoned as an infant in Russia, spent years in an orphanage, and was later adopted by an American family. The psychiatrist also said Sonia suffered a traumatic brain injury in a car crash at 18. After she became a mother, the same expert linked her worsening depression to postpartum struggles and to an intense custody dispute involving Kayla's father. In the days leading up to September 7th, the warning signs became explicit. Police and prosecutors later described Sonia making suicidal statements and threats involving her daughter. Her mother called for help, and officers brought Sonia to a hospital for an emergency psychiatric evaluation. Reporting later described Sonia being released with antidepressants, even as her mother pleaded for staff to keep her longer because she believed her daughter was still in crisis. Early that Sunday morning, a frantic 911 call came from the home. In recordings released by officials, Sonia's mother told dispatchers that 2 toddlers were unresponsive and that she and Sonia were attempting CPR. Sonia could be heard in the background counting compressions and pleading for her children to respond as first responders raced to the scene. Investigators later said the children were found with plastic bags and duct tape placed over their heads. Police also reported that Sonia admitted responsibility, and she was arrested the same day and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case moved fast in the early stages because it happened inside the family home and because key evidence was gathered within hours. The aftermath quickly turned into a mental health as well as a criminal case. While held at the Prince George's County Detention Center, Sonia was placed on suicide watch and evaluated by clinicians. Within days, corrections officials transferred her to Maryland's Forensic Psychiatric Hospital, Clifton T. Perkins Hospital Center, after a psychiatrist concluded it would be a better fit for her care. As the case neared resolution, attorneys and experts argued over motivation and capacity. The psychiatrist who testified described a mix of attachment problems, postpartum depression, and panic tied to fear of losing custody, saying these factors interfered with her ability to think clearly. Sonia's mother also told the court her daughter had a history of mental illness, though she had never received a formal diagnosis. In March of 2017, Sonia Spoon pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. On June 7, 2017, a judge imposed a sentence structured as 70 years with all but 45 years suspended, meaning 45 years to be served, and ordered her committed to Patuxent Correction and Mental Health Center in Jessup, Maryland. Sonia Katerina Spoon is serving a 45-year prison sentence in Maryland custody. Number 7. Zakieya Avery was 28 years old when police charged her in the deaths of 2 of her children in Germantown, Maryland. In official statements, she was identified primarily as the children's mother, living at a townhouse on Cherry Bend Drive in Montgomery County. She shared the home with a roommate, Monifa Denise Sanford, who was 21 at the time. In the immediate aftermath, neighbors described shock and disbelief, saying there had been no obvious signs of turmoil in the home, and they gathered outside with candles and stuffed animals as the story spread through the community. As investigators began piecing together what happened, the case quickly centered on Avery's beliefs rather than a typical motive like money or personal revenge. Police and later court accounts described Avery and Sanford talking about evil spirits and exorcisms and referring to themselves as demon assassins. In court, a judge later said the evidence pointed to delusional thinking that had overtaken Avery's judgment, including the belief that her children were in spiritual danger and that an exorcism was necessary. Reporting on the later proceedings also described a history of mental health struggles and concerns about medication compliance in the period leading up to the attacks. On Friday, January 17, 2014, Montgomery County Police responded to Avery's townhouse after a 911 call. Inside, officers discovered 4 children who had been assaulted. 2 toddlers, Norrell N. Harris, 1-year-old, and Ziana Z. Harris, 2 years old, were pronounced dead at the scene. 2 older siblings, Tania Harris, 5 years old, and Martello Harris, 8 years old, were transported to the hospital and survived. Sanford was also taken for medical treatment. Avery was physically uninjured, interviewed by detectives, and charged that day with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and she was held without bond at the time. The investigation included a close look at events in the hours before police entered the home, including earlier calls that brought attention to the household and led authorities to plan follow-up safety checks. As the case moved through the courts, it drew intense media coverage because it blended family tragedy with claims of spiritual warfare and mental illness. In the courtroom years later, family members expressed complicated emotions, including grief for the children and relief that Avery would receive psychiatric treatment rather than a standard prison sentence. In September of 2016, after Avery admitted responsibility in court, a Montgomery County judge found her not criminally responsible, Maryland's legal standard for criminal insanity. Instead of prison, she was ordered committed to the state's maximum security forensic psychiatric hospital, the Clifton T. Perkins Hospital Center in Jessup. Under Maryland law, that commitment is subject to ongoing review, and any future release would depend on findings that she no longer poses a danger to herself or others. Number 8. Nicholas Wagoner Browning was 15 years old when detectives in Baltimore County, Maryland, accused him of killing his own family in Cockeysville. He was a high school student, often described as an honor student, and a Boy Scout, the kind of teenager teachers and scout leaders expected to grow up steady and responsible. That public image made the allegations feel unreal to people who knew the Brownings only as a quiet suburban family. The household also seemed firmly rooted. Nicholas's father, John W. Browning, 45, was an attorney and longtime partner at a Towson law firm. His mother, Tamara Browning, 44, stayed home with the children. Nicholas was the oldest of 3 boys with 2 younger brothers, Gregory, 14, and Benjamin, 11. Reports described a family active in their church with John Browning also involved in scouting as a leader, which deepened the sense of disbelief when the case broke. In court, the why was contested and emotionally charged. The defense described Nicholas as living under strict control and alleged physical and verbal abuse, arguing that years of fear and conflict pushed him into a fragile state and alcohol use. A forensic psychiatrist hired by the defense testified that Nicholas had alcohol abuse and a dissociative disorder, suggesting he could slip into a trance-like state under stress. Prosecutors challenged that picture, and later reporting noted that state psychiatrists did not find a diagnosable mental illness. On Friday night, February 1, 2008, Nicholas was out with friends. Police later said he returned home during the night and used a handgun that belonged to his father. Authorities said his parents and brothers were killed while they slept. Investigators said he then spent many hours with friends, returned the next day, called 911, and claimed he had discovered his father. As detectives rebuilt the timeline, prosecutors pointed to details they believed showed calculation. They said Nicholas tried to make the home look as if it had been robbed, and they questioned phone activity while he was out with friends, suggesting an attempt to create an alibi. Within days, police said he confessed, was arrested, and directed them to the handgun which had been discarded in bushes near the home. In later coverage of his case, investigators referenced recorded statements in which he explained he believed it would be quicker. He was indicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder, and a judge ruled he would be tried as an adult. In October of 2008, Nicholas pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder, under an agreement that preserved the possibility of parole, and reports from the plea hearing described him crying in court as prosecutors summarized the deaths. In January of 2009, the court imposed 4 life sentences with 2 life terms consecutive and the remaining 2 concurrent. In January of 2014, a judge denied a request to modify that sentence after another hearing in Baltimore County Circuit Court. Nicholas Browning remains incarcerated in Maryland under those life sentences with parole eligibility tied to serving at least 23 years with good behavior. Number 9. Larry Donnell. Andrews, later widely known as Donnie Andrews, was 32 years old when he became linked to 2 killings in Baltimore that would define the rest of his life story. Born on April 29, 1954, he grew up in West Baltimore public housing surrounded by street violence and an economy shaped by drugs and survival. Later profiles described a childhood marked by physical abuse at home and traumatic scenes outside long before he was old enough to leave that world behind. By his teens and 20s, Andrews was known on the street as a bold, stick-up man who targeted drug dealers rather than everyday residents. Accounts of his life often mention a personal rule he claimed to follow. He didn't want women or children involved in what he did. But the same reporting also shows how fragile that kind of code can be when addiction and fear take over. As heroin tightened its grip, money stopped being just profit and became a constant pressure. One more reason to take risks he might once have avoided. In late September of 1986, investigators and later reporting said Andrews was pulled into a contract killing tied to the city's drug trade. Multiple accounts name Warren Bordley, a powerful dealer at the time, as the person who drew Andrews into the job, and Andrews later acknowledged taking it while trying to support his addiction. On September 26, 1986, Andrews and another man drove to Gold Street in West Baltimore, a block known for constant drug activity. 2 young men, Zachary Roach and Rodney Touche Young, were confronted, and both were killed in gunfire. The victims were connected to rival street groups, and the killings were treated as part of a larger struggle for control and retaliation. What happened afterward is what made the case stand out to prosecutors. Andrews later said one of the victims looked at him and asked a single question, why, and that it stayed with him. Months later, he turned himself in to Baltimore homicide detective Ed Burns. Prosecutors later said they had little evidence that could have guaranteed a conviction before Andrews confessed. And instead of treating cooperation like a bargaining chip, he agreed to wear a wire and record conversations that helped investigators build cases against higher-level figures in the drug organization. In 1987, Andrews was sentenced to life in federal prison for the murders. Reporting later noted that he believed he might receive a much shorter term, but the sentence was life and early parole attempts failed. Over time, accounts from attorneys and journalists describe a slow transformation inside prison. He pursued education, worked to end his heroin addiction, and counseled younger inmates, including anti-gang work. During those years, he stayed in contact with Ed Burns and with David Simon, then a Baltimore reporter who would later create The Wire, and Andrews shared street-level knowledge that informed Simon's understanding of how violence and power moved through the city. Andrews was paroled in 2005. After his release, he focused on youth outreach in Baltimore, helped build a non-profit effort known as Why Murder, and became a consultant on The Wire, where his real life helped inspire the character Omar Little. He died in Manhattan, New York on December 13, 2012, at 58 years old.